And I think you touched on it so well. Those are some fantastic examples. I think it works both B2B and B2C. But you know, I don't call it, people call it like a content repository. I don't really like the word repository, but you know, they say, oh, you put up your webinar slides up there, but it's so much more than that. It's a platform for visual content thought leadership, if you will. How can you, as Jessica mentioned, how can you take the content you already have in place? What white papers or reports do you have that you can turn into a self-guided visual format? And don't forget that SlideShare is indexed by the search engines. If you can optimize your presentation, that's a piece of content that can rank on page 1 very quickly. Not to mention your customers or prospects are searching within SlideShare. It's its own search engine. And there's also some really great analytics on the back end. So there's a full dashboard, tells you how optimized your presence is there. But yeah, you know, it's funny, Jessica, the other day I was reading a Moz.com blog, and they said the number one challenge of marketers right now was proving the value of their marketing campaigns. And I thought, wow, it's 2015. The tools are out there, right? The tools, everything's out there. It's just a matter of are you utilizing them in the proper way. So anyway, thank you for that presentation. We do have a couple copies of her book. I have 2 trivia questions. I've got a really engaged room here, I can tell. The first one is, can anyone guess, I think I have this number right, the average number of LinkedIn connections each member has, or one member has? No. No? Do we have $1, Bob? You know, it's funny, when we were on a conversation last week about this, and they were telling me I was going to MC this event. I was like, oh, I'm going to be like the John Davidson of the event. And I got nothing, much like I just did there. One more guess. 378? No. Who guessed 500? All right, this gentleman right here. Oh, this lady right here. That's close enough. I believe it's 947, which is pretty substantial. And Jessica, if you don't mind, if anyone could tell me who John Davidson is.
He was the host of Hollywood Squares, or That's Incredible.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. So without further ado, I was working on some comedy material. But it's really tough. You guys are a tough crowd. So I got this. This comes from one of my, Alex here on my team. A sponsored update walks into a bar. That's all I got. No good? All right. That being said, so next I'd like to bring up, for a quick fireside chat, we don't have a fire, but you know, speaking with Jeroen over here, we were talking about the Yule log, which I thought would be fun for fireside chats to. No, you guys are killing me. You don't know what a Yule log is? It's the VCR fireplace. Comcast has a dedicated channel. Exactly. So I'm going to bring up Shane Snow, who's the CEO and founder of Contently, and then Rob Kurtz, who's a financial consultant who's worked with some amazing companies such as American Express, OpenForm. And do we have Shane and Rod? I think there's going to be a little intro music maybe, and then they're going to come dancing out of the backstage area. Hey, gentlemen, thank you so much. The stage is yours.
There's no fire, though. It's supposed to be a fireside.
Yeah, we were waiting for the pyrotechnics.
We're working on getting a Yule log for the room.
All right. Well, good
Gentlemen.
to see everyone. Thanks for coming and indulging us. This is our version of Pacquiao Mayweather here, although we tend to agree on a lot. But I'm Rod.
I'm Mayweather in this one, right?
All
yeah,
right.
I'm
and I've
Shane.
got the hurt shoulder.
Yeah.
Who watched the fight? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Anyone win any money? Yeah, exactly. So we'll hopefully deliver a little more than they did, though we're not splitting 300 million here. But no, it's good to see all of you. Good to meet all of you. I'm Rod Kurtz. I run a media strategy firm here in New York. Work very closely with Contently, which is how Shane and I know each other. Work with big brands, small brands, sort of everything in between on all things content. I was a journalist, traditional journalist for about 10 years at Inc. Magazine, Business Week, AOL, and the Huffington Post, and covered entrepreneurs all that time. Grew up in a family of entrepreneurs, and I like to say about 3 years ago, I finally drank my own Kool-Aid and became one. And it's been a blast because we were just talking backstage about how I've always consider myself an advocate for entrepreneurs and good brands through my media work, and now to be able to help them directly is tremendously rewarding. And I think Shane and I share a common bond on storytelling. So
that's right. Yeah, my background, we just heard about visual storytelling. I got my start originally in computer science and graphic design, moved into infographic design and telling stories through visuals and through design, and then became a journalist and started writing about technology for Wired Magazine, Fast Company. And now I write for LinkedIn for their influencer program. And 4.5 years ago started Contently, where our mission is to help brands become storytellers and to build relationships with audiences. And in the meantime, give work to creative people, journalists, photographers, so that they can make a living doing what they love with this new sort of world of opportunity to tell stories. And
yeah, I think the thing that I always tell people I work with and at events like this is that the world has definitely changed, and the good news is these days everyone can be a media company. The bad news is these days everyone can be a media company. There's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of crap out there, frankly. And I think a big mission for both Shane and myself is to help whoever we work with tell good, authentic stories that have some resonance, some meaning with who they're trying to reach. So we're just going to kind of riff up here. We came up with a list of topics in a bar, which is where we usually do most of our strategy sessions. We were there last week and just kind of riffing, and I sort of said, this should be our presentation. Let's just talk like we normally do. But I want to preface that by saying, as two journalists up here, we ask questions for a living, and we'd be remiss not to let you do the same. So we'll save some time at the end for questions, but if something comes up as we're talking, just throw up a hand. We're not formal up here. So
if we don't see it,
yeah, just shout out.
My colleague Joe Laser can do like a bird call or something.
Yeah.
Warn us that something's out there.
So where do we begin?
So one of the things that we talked about at the bar was, so brands.
It's true.
One of the things, brands now are in the business of being storytellers. It's like everyone now has launched a magazine that's competing against everyone else's magazine. And yet we don't think of brands as really having a voice or speaking. And so we were talking about how a brand should think about how it should speak, this sort of faceless entity, or maybe a logo that doesn't really have a mouth. Like, how should a brand speak? How should they think about kind of a framework for that? Or
yeah, so when I work with companies, and I'm giving away a little bit of the secret sauce here, but to me, I've always, a lot of things in business, but especially when it comes to brand storytelling, I operate in a world of concentric circles, where I think the most important thing that any brand that's looking to get into this should do is come up with their core message. I actually call it the bar pitch, as opposed to an elevator pitch. If you think of an elevator pitch, it's usually 60 seconds, and you sort of meander as to what you're about. A bar pitch was born literally out of attending events like this, moderating panels, going to a lot of entrepreneurial happy hours, this and that. And I'll sometimes be talking to the founder of a company, big or small, and we're 10 minutes into the conversation, I still don't know what they do. And as a journalist trying to tell their story, it got very frustrating, where I wanted to shake them and say, just tell me what you do. Don't tell me you're a B2B solutions provider in an emerging like, what do you do? Put it in layman's terms. And what I've come up with is this concept of the bar pitch that's essentially 2 sentences for any brand out there, where you sort of identify a relatable problem in the marketplace and then explain how you solve it very succinctly. And it's an exercise, sometimes it takes weeks to go through with some of my clients, but once you zero in on that core message, that is what's going to influence everything from there, this concept of concentric circles. So you've got your core message, your core story as a brand. Next is maybe your elevator pitch. Next is the messaging on your website. Next is the content that you create for your website. Next is the content that you might create for LinkedIn. Next is positioning your CEO as a thought leader in the space. Books, speaking engagements, it all fans out, but it's all got to drive back to that core message so that you have a consistent experience throughout your content.
Yeah, this is actually something that comes from fiction writing, sort of a common method called the snowflake method, which is if you're writing a novel or you're writing a book, I mean nonfiction too, you start out with the one sentence that, say you were on the New York Times bestseller list, and on the list it says, Rod's book, and then the description will be 5 words. That's all that can fit in the page. So what is your one sentence description that boils everything down? And then the next thing you do is you write the thing that would be on the back flap of the book. So what's the one paragraph? And then you write the thing that would be in the cover flap, so the one page. And you do that and you slowly build that out, but everything points back to that core.
Yep.
And a lot of times what brands do when they want to become storytellers, they fail to boil down to the core, and they just say, we're in the pest control business, 10 tips for pest control.
Right.
Like they just jump straight to that, not without thinking about sort of the thing that is going to be, I guess, uniquely theirs.
Right, and that's the challenge. I see a lot of brands, again, big and small out there, that they're trying to start with like ring 4 or 5 in the circle model. You know, they want to create content right away, and I say, hold on, what are you about? You know, creating content for content's sake never works. That contributes to a lot of the noise that we're seeing out there. So I think you really have to zero in on what you're about and make sure that that messaging is consistent. And the funny thing is, it's often a challenge for companies to come up with what that is. The funny thing is when I work with a company that sometimes has multiple co-founders, and I sort of on the spot ask them, you know, take a few minutes, come up with your bar pitch. I sometimes get 3 entirely different bar pitches, and these are people who are closely running the same company. So it's almost a mission statement that you use in practice, and it's, again, going to influence sort of everything you do from there.
Yeah, and when we were talking about the concentric circles, right, I see the same problem or the same idea from a bit of a different perspective, but it's also sort of like a geometric perspective. I talk about the grid, the storytelling grid, where and it sort of maps to the stages of friendship. If you meet someone new and you want to make friends with them, one of the best ways to do that is to sit down at coffee and at lunch and wherever and tell stories, right? And eventually you tell stories about yourself. But if you lead with the whole entire history of your family and you and your childhood, it maybe is a little off-putting versus talking about things that you have in common first, right? Shared interests. This is why talking about the weather, sort of the universal thing, because it's something that everyone's mildly interested in at least.
Right.
But I talk about there's sort of 3 tiers of sort of storytelling. The top tier is shared interests and values. So things that you can all agree on that you care about, and that as a brand you want people to know that you care about. So this is getting back to the core. What as a brand do you care about? And you can tell those stories, and they don't involve talking about yourself at all. Then as people lean forward, as you have more of a relationship, maybe the second date sort of relationship, or people are actually a little bit more interested in you, then you can talk about the second tier, which is basically your history or your customer's history, the people who are involved in your world, right? And this is when, you know, in a real relationship, you could talk about your friends or your family or whoever. And then at the bottom tier is basically the resume stage. No one's interested in learning about your resume until they've learned those other things too, that you're actually someone they'd be interested in getting to know, gotten to know a little bit more about you and who you care about. And then they can get to you. And so this is, for a brand, it's shared interests, it's stories about your customers and your history, and then it's stories about your products. And you can cut that by stories that are never going to fade, so what we call in journalism evergreen, or stories that are seasonal, things that are sort of events that you can plan on, right? The Mayweather-Pacquiao fight. It's something that you can sort of plan on, and you can tell stories around that leading up to it. And then there's timely stories, something that happens that you want to sort of jump on. And you can put content in each of these buckets, but it all starts with this, what are your values, and what's going to get people interested in what you have to say at all.
And of course, keeping your audience in mind. You know, you sort of have to figure out, when I work with brands, we often come up with like a fictional persona of, you know, who is your reader, who's consuming your content, who are you trying to engage with as a brand. And I think, again, that's something that is sort of a simple exercise that a lot of companies don't take the time to do, but that's important because you really are, you know, think about what you're trying to do with so-called content marketing. You're trying to build a relationship, hopefully a long-term relationship with prospective customers and customers, and you have to hook them in, you know, sort of authentically and get them. You know, I find that consumers have more choices than ever right now, and they want to align with brands that they feel good about, that they, you know, have some kind of conversation with. Look at a Tom Shoes or a Warby Parker that, you know, done a great job of like letting people into their brand. And as a result, you know, end up with brand loyalists.
And this is a great source. I think there's a lot of discussion, especially in sort of traditional journalism or people who are afraid of the brand content thing. There's a lot of discussion about like, oh, people would never pay attention to a brand, or they'd never trust a brand or care about a brand. But if you think about it in your life, there are brands that you choose because you like them, and you actually trust what they have to say. So I always talk about one of the 2 stocks I own is Tesla, because I believe in the company. I believe that they're very smart about the future of mobility and energy. And so I'm likely to listen to what they have to say because I like the brand. I have friends who are mountain climbers that they like Patagonia. They'll take the advice from Patagonia on which mountains to climb and how to do it.
Well, and that's, I think, the great news for probably everyone in this room is that increasingly media consumers are more agnostic about the source. If they see a brand that really knows their space, it's something they're passionate about, they might actually prefer it come from Patagonia as opposed to hiking magazine or whatever it is, because they're literally invested in it. And I think when you have brands that are doing quality work, it sort of raises the bar for everyone in a good way, that you really can essentially become a media company that has a loyal following among your customers.
Yeah, one of my friends is a personal trainer, and he talks about, he writes once in a while for Men's Health and details in these magazines. And he says that the editors will just say, thanks for your workout story, great, we're going to post it. We don't care if it works or not. This is just kind of the, and not outing those publications specifically, but this happens because the people who are working on those aren't necessarily experts versus, say, a GNC that, like, their product better work if you buy it. So they might actually, sort of counterintuitively, there might be some incentive to do better stuff.
Yeah, they have skin in the game. It's sort of that rising tide lifts all boats. If they produce quality content that gets you excited to go out hiking, you're going to go to Patagonia and get your gear. That's the kind of relationship I think you're looking to build.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about pregnancy. Just throwing that out there, nice segue. But this has to do with what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think Shane and I, one of the things we always zero in on is authenticity for brands. That there's a lot of commodity crap content out there. There's sort of this gold rush that I guess you and I are benefiting from, of every brand in the world wants to do content. And I think the real issue with authenticity is that, yes, as a brand, you're potentially going to do some advertorial type stuff where you're trying to promote a product, or you're trying to create sort of authentic content. And I always say to these brands, look, either is fine, but you can't be a little bit pregnant with this. That if you're trying to, seamlessly weave a product into what is being framed as editorial, people have a pretty good BS detector. And I think even more importantly, as this content marketing community continues to develop, there's almost a fourth estate for that, or a fifth estate we talked about, where, the media is covering this. And if you see a brand doing something kind of shady or just, not good practice, I won't name names, but there have been examples over the past couple of years, you're going to get called out on it. So it's really better to either do really great advertorial that's promoting your product, your campaign, whatever it is, or just diving in and doing an editorial piece and hoping that it draws that connection with an audience. I mean, I've worked with, again, clients big and small that devote a tremendous amount of resources to really comprehensive, rich, immersive content. And we'll get into sort of the ROI of this, but it's either you're doing editorial or you're not.
Yeah,
you start getting in that no man's land, and you're basically going to lose everyone in the process.
So the ROI thing is something that comes up at every talk, conference, discussion, board meeting about content marketing.
Yep.
What is your perspective on that?
So what I tell companies is that it's tricky, because if you're working with a marketing department, they've got their numbers, they've got their metrics, they've got the people they answer to, and in some cases we're talking about significant investment in this kind of thing. To me, it's a long game. You can't just say, hey, we're going to try content marketing for 3 months. I think it's about building that relationship with your consumers, and there are ways to track that with social media and engagement and obviously traffic, but there is a little bit of a leap of faith with this, that brands experiment with different things and different formats, and there are different ways of measuring the resonance. But I think in some ways it's not an ROI first endeavor, in my view.
Right.
It might be tough to hear, but it's sort of the truth.
The other truth of the matter is that the reason people are doing this is because they've seen it work without having precisely measured it. And there's a compounding effect to content marketing and to doing content. And kind of back to actually the gym again, you can't get a 1-month gym subscription and then expect for your whole life to be changed, right? But if you do it over the course of a year, you can see significant results. And so if you go to the gym and every time you measure your waist, after you do some sit-ups and you measure your waist, and you do some more sit-ups and you measure your waist, you're gonna be disappointed.
Right.
But it's this compounding effect, and it's the muscle building exercise that is really the way that brands, so the challenge with ROI, right, is measuring the long-term effect and not being distracted by the short-term results, which will go up in the long term.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific analogy, and I look at what companies are trying to do, and again, it's creating this conversation, this dialogue with your customers, and I think no longer is content marketing sort of this add on, if we have the resources to do it, we'll do it. I mean, this has become marketing. This is how brands are communicating. It's, yeah, you might have your Google ads and your TV spots or whatever it is, but there's a reason this industry has grown so much is because it works. You need to be part of this conversation, and it's sometimes glaring to me for companies that have, no content and no social media presence. A lot of what we do is come in and again, identify, where that makes sense for you, because if you are a pest control company, it's going to be different than if you're a financial services company. You got to find that angle, that story that's going to resonate. And you see examples out there of, one that comes to mind, I think, is Charmin has like a very funny Twitter account, because what are you going to tweet seriously about toilet paper? So you need to sort of find your message, your storyline, and again, it's about sort of that long-term brand building.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about a lot at Contently is how there's this shift. There either needs to be a shift, or in many companies there is a shift already, between treating content marketing as another channel. You have your email marketing, your social marketing, your search marketing, and your ad campaigns, and your retargeting, and your content marketing, where what's happening now is storytelling is starting to fuel all of those things. Content should feed your email marketing campaign. Your sales team should get better. We track this stuff at Contently. People open our salespeople's emails and reply when they send them content at a higher rate than when they send them, just sort of a please, let's get on the phone.
Right.
And this is how they get deals across the finish line, is when our clients or prospects have questions or whatever, they'll send them content that helps them out, that we've written, that also proves sort of the value that we can deliver.
Well, and you've got that great example of within Contently, how your own content strategy has led to business.
Right, yeah, so we can do the case study on ourselves, but right, like we've oriented our business around using storytelling and content as part of how that comes before all of these other channels, right? Social media and things like LinkedIn are the way we engage people with the content that we've created, right? And the way we measure and optimize the content that we're going to create again, rather than sort of opening up LinkedIn and saying, let's post something, right? It's about the story that we're then, like you said, it's sort of the ripple effect of the concentric circles. So I think, with financial services companies, especially, a lot of the work that's being done is either sort of B2C, right? Like you have branches everywhere, or it is very much this sort of talking to investors or talking to advisors, and those are, I mean, B2B and B2C are kind of the two broad categories, but with finance, it's a lot easier to measure the ROI. We've seen with our own clients, because there's very sort of discrete goals and discrete players that you're trying to do, especially when you're trying to convert someone to becoming a customer, to remaining a customer, or to, in a B2B sale. And so you can track either those touch points, those mini conversions along the way, people subscribing, people opening your emails, listening to your emails, or the brand effect, the brand lift. You can actually do traditional marketing studies to measure the effect of your content marketing over a long period of time. But if you do a brand lift study after every blog post you do, it's not going to work. Just like,
and in between, you can iterate. If you see a certain blog post on a certain topic really spiked, all right, maybe we zero in on this topic. If you find people are coming to the site through certain search terms, all right, maybe we devote a little more attention to that. But the thing to keep in mind, I mean, you mentioned sort of traditional tracking of this marketing. I think the thing to keep in mind, and I said this at a Contently Summit maybe a year or so ago, and I talk about it a lot, is that we're all hell-bent on this new buzzword of content marketing, and everyone's racing to figure out the solution. Advertising and marketing over time hasn't really changed. It comes down to storytelling. Think of all the great commercials. The example I always use is like those Taster's Choice commercials back in the 80s, where it followed this couple as they were I think they lived in the same building or whatever, and it was like this narrative. It was one of the first, I think the first example of serial commercials. It's the same thing. It's about telling a story, either about your brand or something that relates to your brand, and keeping people coming back. So, don't bang your head against the wall trying to figure out, what is our content marketing. Just think about, as a brand, what is your storytelling? What is your connection to customers? The format has changed, and I think, frankly, it's a better opportunity for brands out there now that they can become their own media companies, but you got to figure out what makes sense for your audience.
Yeah, and before, I guess, back in the day before the internet, right, a lot of marketing and advertising was about branding. It was about getting people to remember your brand. And with the internet, it was sort of less clear how to do that.
Right.
And now with storytelling, I mean, the whole thing about relationship building, that's, I think, the right analogy, that over time you're building a relationship with someone rather than this very transactional internet that we used to have, where it was you're clicking on the ad or the offer, and not sort of giving something first. And I think that's kind of the meta point that we try to make, in our work is that as a brand, if you want people to like you, you have to give them something first rather than beg them.
Who has questions? There must be some stirring back there.
A lot of brands are concerned with what they call brand safe. We all know that a lot of the content that does best is stuff that's not safe. How do I've had trouble sometimes threading that needle. How do you do that?
Well, I think one of the things I preach about content, and I working with big brands, I'm certainly sensitive to that aspect. There are ways to be safe but original. There are ways to offer a new perspective on something. I work with a lot of CEOs who create content, contribute posts to a whole bunch of external media. And the thing I always tell them is to sort of be contrarian. The easy example I point to is it's not 7 ways your company should use Twitter. It might be 7 reasons your company shouldn't use Twitter. So, sort of tilt the conventional wisdom on its side that still can be considered safe, but it's standing out from some of the noise out there.
Yeah, I think the default reaction to wanting to be safe, right, is do what everyone else is doing. Like that doesn't actually mean safe, right?
Right.
I think, even in our company, right, we have clients that, and there's sensitive things around the content we do. We'll get emails from our CEO yelling at us for content that we've done, right? And sometimes we have to be careful about that. And I think of it, I actually think that in brainstorming and sort of creativity, there's power to constraints. And you look in the history of art and creativity, that having bumpers on the bowling alley can actually make you, this is why haikus can be so creative, is because you have the format, you don't have to think about the format itself. So it doesn't make it any easier sort of from ambiguous, let's talk about why brand safe isn't hard. It still is hard, but I think the way you approach it has to be, we accept the constraints about being safe, but now how can we be creative and original inside of that?
Well, and it's also the format too. You could dive into long form content, which is finding more and more traction, and you're seeing more and more brands do it. It could be a social strategy. You could develop a very strong presence on LinkedIn, for example, or Instagram. Maybe it's a tip of the day on Instagram or something like that. So it's not just the content itself, but it's the format and delivery that you might find your audience loves, sort of short bursts of information, and maybe of all places, Instagram is the place to do it.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is I think speaking of safe, one of the safest things you can do as a content marketer is introduce something new to the internet. And I think original research is a vastly untapped or undertapped strategy for this, that you can be the most boring, safe, strict brand in the world, and you can still do original research that you can then package as stories that will get people talking. People talk about stuff that's entertaining or that's novel or that sort of connects to them personally, right? And if you can't be entertaining, then you can at least be novel.
Right. Who else? Who's curious?
We heard this in the previous speaker about being able to justify marketing, and that's the biggest problem that I guess most companies have. Can you talk a little bit about justifying or putting these interesting posts up, and if your company isn't so big on how many people look at your website, but are interested more in about sales, and it's hard sometimes to see a direct correlation between sales and some interesting Instagram posts. So I'd be curious what you have to say.
So what's the Contently pitch? How do you?
On justifying marketing itself or justifying content marketing? The pitch is that over time, you're going to be able to show that there is some effect on sales, or that there's a positive effect and that it does pay off. What you need to do is figure out what are the proxies in the short run that are going to help you build relationships with people, and then how are you going to tie the thread from relationships as measured online by whatever it is. We think that attention time, how much time people spend over time with your content, if you can draw a correlation between that and some sort of measurable business effect, right? So again, it depends if you're B2B or B2C, but let's pretend you're a B2B company that a sale is worth X, and that someone who subscribes to your newsletter is 1% likely to convert to a sale in the next 6 months. So you can actually assign a value to every newsletter subscription, and then you can back up to people who spend this much time with you over time are X% likely to subscribe to the newsletter. So you can do that math eventually, but what it does take is the leap of faith in the beginning, just like the gym analogy. I guess it is sort of persuasive storytelling, and part of what our job at Contently is to do, because this is an emerging space and because everyone has that question, is to tell the stories of people who have done it and how long it took and what it took to be successful. So we have this publication, and we brought magazines here, specifically our finance issue about content marketing case studies and features, and going into companies that have made this work and how they did it. I think that's a lot of the justification that you need to, sort of like Wile E. Coyote runs and there's no ground underneath him, and until he looks down, he's not going to fall. You need to help sort of get to the other side without looking down and falling, with sort of the justification from the rest of the space and the case studies. But eventually you ought to be able to back out the business effect from this stuff. And companies have done it and are doing it.
And it's also, you need to think creatively about building that bridge. It's not just content for content's sake. To Shane's analogy about the newsletter, you need some sort of discrete call to action. Maybe you create a lot of content and then you do an offline event that you get people in the room, for speakers. This is really the most quality content is essentially a value add for your customers. It's something you're throwing in. If Home Depot does a whole series of how-to guides, how to paint your fence, how to paint your living room, whatever it is, you might Google how to paint a fence, wind up on Home Depot, you're reading this article. Oh, I'm gonna get my paint now. You've given me something, and in exchange, as a consumer, I'm gonna feel that stronger connection to you. So, that is a whole aspect of that we didn't really get into. But search is a huge component. That if you identify, your core message, the topic that you want to be influencers, experts in, and really create quality content on that, Google's gonna reward you. Question here. Or.
Knowing that this is an emerging space and that with the rise of social media and digital marketing, the lines between PR and marketing are becoming grayer, we'll say. What do you feel like the role of the PR professional is in content marketing?
It depends on the company, right? A lot of times content marketing falls under PR. A lot of times PR falls outside of content marketing. For us, we found that the best PR strategy has been to, kind of like our salespeople, instead of sending reporters pleas for covering us, send them content, right? Create content and send the people who are covering your industry the content you're creating to help them out in their beats. That's a great way to build relationships with reporters, then get them to sit down with you and pay attention when you do have a story.
I think PR can be, I actually work with some PR firms. I think PR can be helpful for distribution once you do create that content, that they do have those contacts, they can get it out in the wider world. But I think the reason I always recommend sort of a content strategy before a PR strategy is that, okay, say you've got the best publicists in the world and they send out a blast email to journalists. Having been on the receiving end of thousands of pitches over the years, and I'm sure you're the same, okay, pitch piques my interest. First thing I'm gonna do is either Google the company or go to their website. And if I go there and I don't see like a lot of content or get a sense that they're an expert in this area, say you were pitching the CEO as a source or something like that, increasingly I think journalists look for like, all right, what have you created from a thought leadership standpoint? Oh, you haven't done anything? Like, I just don't have as good a feeling about the company, and that's where the pitch might fall off. Whereas if you do create all that content and then a journalist via a PR pitch lands on your website and sees you've written for Forbes and Inc. or whatever it is, oh, they're the real deal. I'm going to give them more thought.
And I think one other thing that I think is important now, that we have a window where if a brand does something really notable in content marketing, they're going to get the meta press in the ad trade that then amplifies that. This is why the Oreo thing, the Oreo tweet will never die. It's sort of like if my grandmother did a backflip on a bike on YouTube, people would share that video like crazy because they don't expect her to do that versus me to do that. And so people will say, Marriott released this short film, Two Bellmen, that was really cool. And people said, wow, I can't believe that this was made by a hotel.
Right.
And that gets extra additional PR value. So we have a window in the next couple of years where that's going to go away. But in the meantime, the sort of PR meta pitch is, this is great content, and by the way, someone you didn't expect to create it created it.
Sure.
Excellent, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
All right.
Shane Snow and Rod Kurtz. Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.